Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's so great to have you all here for this online event. We've got new research and resources to support gender equality action in Victorian workplaces, and Vic Health is so pleased to welcome you all here and to have with us the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence, the Honourable Gabrielle Williams, and speakers from Common Cause Australia and the Behavioural Insights team to launch these new resources. My name is Emma Fulu and I'm going to be your MC today. I'm the founder and executive director of an organisation called the Equality Institute, and we're a global feminist organisation working to promote gender equality. So this is, really exciting for me to see this new research and these new resources, which I know are going to be incredibly valuable for all of us. I know you can't see each other, but over 480 people have signed up to this event, which is really wonderful and I think demonstrates the keen interest in this work. And before we start, I just wanted to take a moment, and as we gather for this event, I know we're all physically dispersed, but let's take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we meet today. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the custodians of the land where I'm sitting today, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all sit today, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of this country. So a little bit about today's event. We're going to be exploring two new resources. The first one is the Victorians' experience of sexism and sexual harassment while working remotely during the coronavirus. And this report was produced in partnership with the Behavioural Insights team with the support of the Victorian Office for Women. And the second resource is Framing Gender Equality Message Guide. And this is the third in a series of values-based message guide produced by Vic Health. It's been based on extensive research by Common Cause Australia on behalf of Vic Health and the Together for Equality and Respect partnership, also with support from the Outer East Primary Care Partnership. So this is a really important moment that we're in. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the Gender Equality Act is coming into effect from March. And this is the first of its kind in the country. And I think it's going to be an absolute game changer in terms of advancing equality. But I know for many organisations, the new obligations might, feel a little bit scary. And these resources are really going to be so valuable to you as you start to move forward on that journey. In terms of just a bit of housekeeping, I know you're all on Slido, so if you've got questions for the presenters, please submit that through the online platform. If you're on a desktop, that should appear on the page. And if you're in the mobile, there's a tab at the top of your screen with the Q&A, which will take you to the submission page. You can vote on the questions that you'd like to see asked by clicking on the green tick, and the team will be moderating those, and we'll try and get to as many of those questions as we can during the Q&A session. The recording, today's event's also being recorded, and that's going to be made available for on the Vic Health website. And finally, if you're using social media, please use the hashtag #GenderEqualityAtWork. So let's get into it. Let me first introduce Dr. Sandro Di Maio, who's the CEO of Vic Health. He is a medical doctor and globally renowned public health expert and advocate. Sandro was previously the CEO of the EAT Foundation, which is a science-based global platform for food systems transformation. And he's also the author of The Doctor's Diet and the co-host of ABC television show Ask the Doctor. So thanks, Sandro. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Emma. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Yep. Great. I'd just like to start also by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to also acknowledge any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leaders, community members or emerging leaders with us online around Victoria or beyond tuning in, and the continued commitment and leadership that you show in this space and in many important spaces around health and equity. Minister Williams, Emma, thank you, fellow speakers, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. Thank you for joining us this morning for such an important launch of some work that's been a long time coming and we know will make an important impact for the health and wellbeing of all Victorians. I'd like to start also by acknowledging the state and local government policymakers attending this morning. Your continued commitment is so critical, and also the wider sector that is so passionately focused on the prevention of violence against women and the achievement of gender equality. VicHealth statewide COVID wellbeing survey conducted in 2020 found clearly that women aged 25 to 34 had significantly poorer mental health outcomes than other Victorians. They continued to experience lower levels of life satisfaction and reported their wellbeing to be low and experienced high levels of psychological distress. We know that unfair discrimination, harassment, and derogatory stereotyping all continue to contribute to the poorer mental health of many Victorians and of many Victorian women. Partnering with the Victorian Office for Women and the Behavioural Insights team, we at VicHealth have been privileged to capture these experiences so that government, agencies like ourselves, and all workplaces can work together to ensure that women are always safe from harassment, whether it be at home or indeed in the office. To ensure that we are talking about these issues in a way that is empowering and connects with a broader group of Australians to create meaningful impact for women and girls across Victoria and everywhere, we've partnered with Mark Chenery from Common Cause Australia. The Framing Gender Equality Guide contains key recommendations that will help us all to strengthen support and the continued and critical work that still needs to be done ahead of us to ensure gender equality is achieved and the continued support of gender equality initiatives here in Australia and indeed in the state of Victoria. It is based on extensive research undertaken by Common Cause Australia on behalf of VicHealth and the Together for Equality and Respect partnership with the support of the Outer East Primary Care Partnership. The value of the report and these guides, though, are further strengthened by the continued leadership shown by the Victorian Government to meaningfully address gender inequality. The recent establishment of the Commission for Gender Equality in the public sector and the introduction of the Victorian Gender Equality Act are crucial examples of world-leading progress, and they're celebrated and supported in every aspect whenever we can by VicHealth. Today, we are honoured to have the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence and the Minister for Women, the Honourable Gabrielle Williams, to launch this report. Minister, we have thoroughly enjoyed working with your office in the development of this important piece of work. We continue to be inspired by and truly commend your leadership, which resonates, I know, beyond our state borders and even our national borders. So thank you for joining us. Well done to the team. Well done to the team at across our partners. And back to you, Emma.
Thanks so much, Sandro. Well, now it is my absolute honour to introduce Minister Gabrielle Williams. Gabrielle Williams, as you said, Sandro, is the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence, Minister for Women and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in the Victorian Government. And she was appointed to the Cabinet in 2018, having previously served as a Parliamentary Secretary, and proudly represents her local community as the member for Dandenong. Welcome, Minister Williams.
Thank you, Emma, very much for that welcome, and to Sandro for your comments and wonderful introduction too. Before I begin though, please let me also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all gathered and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any other elders who may be here with us today. And of course, to the team at VicHealth, an enormous amount of work goes into this research and in the materials that are produced as well, and I'll touch on that, but obviously in particular to Dr. Sandro Di Maio, who is a powerhouse, not just in your role at Vic Health, Sandro, but across various parts of the sort of health advocacy sector, and have been a great partner to the government on this project and many others. So thank you. I also, though, want to acknowledge Emma Hunt from the Behavioural Insights team and Mark Chenery from Common Cause Australia, and everyone that's been involved in putting these two incredible resources together that we're here to celebrate and launch today. I'm really delighted to be able to be here with you today, particularly in a very timely period and I'll touch on that, but in terms of to discuss an issue or results, some more insights into an issue as significant as sexism and sexual harassment in the workplace. In a week where we have again been reminded of how much work we have to do. And we've been reminded in incredibly stark fashion. And I think it's an important discussion that is again being brought into front page news, although we might all regret and lament the fact that it takes these sorts of incidents and repeated incidents for us to be, again, talking about this as a community and talking about the need for change. But despite the fact that for some, particularly this week, these might be, fleetingly topical, for Vic Health, for the government, and for many other parts of our community, this is an ongoing discussion and one that we've been attempting to drive for some time. And for many advocates in our community, many of which might be on this webinar today, this has been an advocacy effort that has spanned decades, sometimes 40 odd years of individual and collective advocacy to have issues of gender equality and of an advocacy, trying to highlight the impact of violence against women. And finally, we're at a period of time where this discussion has entered the mainstream to a large degree, which is great, but there is a lot more to do. So to have the opportunity today to launch this piece of work, this piece of research, which represents, I think, our third phase of investment in Vic Health's research into bystander action to prevent violence against women, it's incredibly sobering, I think. And without wanting to preempt too much the findings, I did want to reflect on a few of them just to highlight, I think, just the significance of what this piece of research tells us, of what it then will hopefully translate to in terms of our knowledge building and therefore then our response to this in terms of how we build safer workplaces, safer communities, and ultimately stronger communities in the process as well. But before I get to that, can I also acknowledge the effort that it takes to quickly adapt a research project in new times. And obviously when I think this piece of work was originally envisaged, we weren't mid-pandemic, and that was not front of mind. So I just want to say a very hearty thanks to those who were able to pivot this piece of work and make it relevant to the circumstances that we're all living through at the moment. And we might have expected, in looking at sexual harassment and sexism in an environment where most of us are working from home, that things might look a little brighter. The sad reality is they don't. And I think that really is the power of this research, is that it's revealed to us that even in these change conditions, this continues to be an entrenched and persistent issue for women in our workplaces and indeed women in our communities. So just to reflect on a few of the takeaways that I took out of this research, the fact that 1 in 5 Victorians experienced sexism and sexual harassment while working remotely, and 1 in 3 Victorians saw or heard about sexism and sexual harassment are happening to others. That's incredibly sobering, incredibly concerning. On top of that, and maybe it's unsurprising, that women working remotely were at greater risk of sexism and sexual harassment compared to men, and women aged 18 to 34 experienced and witnessed sexism and sexual harassment at greater rates than older colleagues, so younger women in particular. And in addition to that, that entry-level workers reported experiencing sexism and sexual harassment at greater rates than more senior workers. This is all important, not just for the sake of knowing it, but for what it can then lead to, for how we better understand the challenge and then therefore how we can better respond to it. And I'll touch a little bit about the government's work on that, which I know Emma and Sandra have also mentioned, and I won't go into detail, but I will touch on it. But before I do that, I also want to commend the work that's gone into the Framing Gender Equality Message Guide. These resources are incredibly important, particularly at a time when there is a greater focus on policy change, on meaningful change, on us actually doing things differently. So these sorts of guides, I think, really do go to supporting our organisations and our broader community into knowing how to embark upon that change. There's a big step sometimes between being cognizant of the fact that you need to change to then knowing how to do it. And these sorts of guides and the work that's gone into developing it really are incredibly valuable and are a great support to all parts of our community in being able to take that next big step, and probably the most significant one in terms of taking action. So I want to thank Vic Health and its partners, Common Cause and Together for Equality and Respect Partnership, of course, with also with the Outer East Primary Care Partnership. Work like this can seem frustrating. I'm always very conscious when I talk about gender equality or about violence against women, that I come to this role at a time when these conversations are able to be had, where there is an acceptance to listen by and large, whereas many people working in this sector have been advocating for change for long before it was acceptable to be having these discussions at all. And so I'm always very conscious, as many of us are, that we come to this discussion standing on the shoulders of all those who came before. And I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that. And of course, if it wasn't for that advocacy from many of you in this call, from many of the sectors that you represent, from, of course, organisations like Vic Health and all its partners over time, we wouldn't be in a position where, as a government, we're now able to do things like introduce the Gender Equality Act, having a Gender Equality Commissioner, start in our own backyard with one of the largest workforces in the state, being the public sector workforce. But more than that, not only trying to change the way those workplaces function and look so that they are more inclusive of women and that they deliver better outcomes for women, but also through that act to look at our policies and programs and see, with a gender lens, and see how they might be impacting upon women across our community. And that really does allow us to reach into the way we do things, reach into community, and make sure that the way that we are doing things is not inadvertently negatively impacting or contributing to entrenched discrimination or inequality in our community. And I think that's a really important step forward for us as policymakers and as governments to be able to embark upon. But it's one that we couldn't do without the individuals and the sectors that have been pushing us to do this for generations, but also without the partners that are now walking with us to make this a reality and to make sure that we're affecting the change that we need to be able to affect. So that's a very long-winded way of acknowledging the work that's being done, but also of saying thank you. Thank you for the resources that we're talking about today in this webinar, but also the work that's being done across many sectors to bring to life a response to the growing body of research that's developing, and is really the work that's being done to make sure that we are building a better tomorrow than the today that we are in, and certainly a better tomorrow than yesterday. So thank you very much for all the work that's gone into this. I look forward to partnering with you and for us to be able to demonstrate collective leadership in both an Australian context, but also in a global context on these very important issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Williams. That was a really perfect way, I think, to set the stage for the rest of our discussion. And as you said, it reminds us of how much work we still have to do, but also how far we've come, and the fact that, acknowledging really the survivors and advocates who have really created the foundation for this work to be possible. So thank you for that. So let's hear more about the actual results and the guides. And we're going to have time for Q&A after we hear a couple of presentations. So let me first introduce Emma Hunt, who's a senior advisor based in the Sydney office, leading the BITS work and on policy areas, including gender equality and justice. And Emma has extensive experience in policy development and project management, working for the government in Australia at both the federal and state levels. She has a law degree and has worked as a nationally accredited mediator, and also has a master's in international and human rights law from the University of New South Wales. So thank you.
Many thanks, Emma. Many thanks, Minister Williams, and many thanks, Sandra. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today and great to see so many of you on the line as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which I'm dialing in from today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Emma mentioned, my name is Emma Hunt. I'm a senior advisor at the Behavioural Insights team, or BIT, and I'll be presenting on some work today that BIT has done in partnership with Vic Health and the Victorian Office for Women on sexism and sexual harassment during remote working in 2020. And as Emma mentioned, I understand there'll be some time for questions towards the end of today's fantastic event. So just before I get started, I thought I'd do a very quick overview of BIT and what we do. So Behavioural Insights is the study of human behaviour and how humans actually behave. And after 50 years of BI research, we know that when making all sorts of decisions and judgments, the human brain defaults to using rules of thumb, shortcuts, and is subject to biases. And you can see on the screen some that I've pulled out that might be relevant to our discussion today. I'll just touch on the first one in a bit more detail, which is that we know that people by and large are very sensitive to what other people do and think and like to follow a crowd. And thinking about the context that we're talking about today, that can make bystanding and taking action in response to sexism and sexual harassment very difficult, particularly if somebody is working in an organisation or culture that doesn't kind of support and encourage that action. So just to sort of take a little bit of a step back, I think what BIT really believes is that understanding these different behavioural patterns, barriers and motivators can help policymakers and workplaces design both policies and programs in a way that makes sure they're more effective as they sort of account for these behavioural traits that we have. And that is where the Behavioural Insights team comes in. So at BIT, one of the things that we do quite a bit of work on is incorporating behavioural insights into policy and program design to achieve gender equality outcomes. Across Australia and the UK, we have a specialist team that works in this space, and we also have partnerships with kind of leading thinkers and academics in the sphere to make sure we have access to some of the latest research, which is really exciting. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of the work that we do overall, if you look to the right of the screen, you'll see that we've done some work producing a guide to help employers in the UK use behavioural insights to close the gender pay gap. We've previously done some work with Vic Health and the Office for Women on encouraging bystander action in response to sexual harassment on campus at Victorian universities. We've done a little bit of work looking at encouraging women to kind of undertake STEM subjects with the UNDP, and we've also done some work in New South Wales on increasing the uptake of flexible kind of options in the workplace. So quite a broad portfolio of work there contributing towards gender equality outcomes in Australia and around the world. So one of the issues within our gender equality portfolio that BIT is obviously very passionate about is designing policies and programs to effectively prevent sexism and sexual harassment, including in the workplace. And that's obviously what I'm here to talk to you about today. But before we jump into that, I thought I would just very quickly define the problem. It's already been kind of outlined in some detail by the Minister, and I know that everyone on this call is probably very across these statistics already, so I will just go through it quite quickly, but I just wanted to sort of set the scene for the work we were doing a little bit. So as I'm sure many of you know, in 2018, the Human Rights Commission reported that 20% of Australians have been sexually harassed at work in the past 12 months. And we know that this has really serious implications, both for employees in terms of health and wellbeing outcomes, and also thinking about kind of ongoing careers and progression in the workplace. And it also is a sort of issue in terms of thinking about workplaces and the economy more broadly in relation to sort of reduced productivity that it causes and sort of increased staff turnover. Australia also could perform better in relation to international gender equality standards. A recent report that was released last year measuring gender equality in 153 countries ranked Australia 44th overall, including in relation to indicators relating to gender equality in the workplace. And we also know that frequent and unchallenged sexist behaviour can have negative impacts on mental health and wellbeing outcomes and affect people's employment opportunities in the long term. So I guess the sexism, and sexual harassment is a really serious problem in Australian workplaces. But the other thing we know about it is that it can be really hard to address. So new evidence is increasingly showing that many sort of well-meaning initiatives, once thought to be effective at changing behaviour around sexism and sexual harassment, such as organisational-wide sort of mandatory diversity training, are unfortunately not making as much difference as we would like and can also backfire. So I guess one thing that I just wanted to highlight is that not only addressing sexism and sexual harassment work, a very serious problem, it can also be a very kind of difficult one to tackle, and sort of making sure that initiatives that are being rolled out kind of across jurisdictions and in the workplace are effective, but also don't have any unintended negative consequences. Another thing I think that really contributed to the challenge of designing effective policy and interventions to prevent sexism and sexual harassment at work that policymakers and workplaces faced in 2020 when we were doing this work was obviously the coronavirus. So last year, the coronavirus kind of changed the working lives of many Australians in unprecedented ways. There were a lot of people who sadly lost their jobs. And for those people who were working, many were forced to do so online. And I just wanted to acknowledge that the effects of this were obviously felt particularly strongly in Victoria, which was subject to sort of some of the most lengthy lockdowns of any Australian jurisdiction. So we know that during this coronavirus remote working period, the way that colleagues and employers are communicating and interacting changed drastically. And I guess there was an assumption made or some sort of discussion around what sexism and sexual harassment might look like in this changed context, but obviously it was a new context. And so despite the importance of it in terms of thinking about designing policies and interventions to prevent these behaviours, there was a gap in terms of that knowledge. And I think the thing that we just wanted to really highlight today is that in order for policymakers and workplaces to take practical steps towards preventing sexism and sexual harassment at work, we obviously know that we need that information and the evidence around what is happening. And so that can feed directly into developing these evidence-based strategies for prevention and response. So to fill this knowledge gap, BAT in partnership with Vic Health and the Office for Women conducted a survey of 1,000 Victorian men and women who were working remotely in 2020 due to coronavirus-related lockdowns. We asked participants about the types of sexism and sexual harassment they experienced during remote working, the types of sexism and sexual harassment they witnessed during remote working, whether these behaviours increased or decreased while working remotely, whether Victorians felt that they knew how to or were able to respond to behaviours, and any barriers that they faced when responding. And I'm going to go through some of the headline findings from this piece of research today. But before I do, I just wanted to note that the findings of this survey obviously represent a particular and unprecedented moment in time. Nonetheless, we really do feel like understanding what sexism and sexual harassment look like in this kind of new remote working context is a critical first step to enabling policymakers and workplaces effectively develop strategies to tackle these behaviours as we have sort of increased maybe hybrid working models in 2021 and also thinking beyond that time frame as well. So I'll now sort of speak to some of those key findings from the report. So as Minister Williams mentioned in her introduction, we did unfortunately find that sexism and sexual harassment remains a really serious problem in remote working, with almost 1 in 5 Victorians experiencing sexism and sexual harassment and over 1 in 3 witnessing sexism and sexual harassment while working remotely in 2020. Of the 10 behaviours that we asked about, which are set out in the graph on the right, and hopefully that's not too small for people to read, apologies if so, but the most frequently reported behaviour by survey participants was being asked intrusive or offensive questions about their private life or physical appearance, and that was reported by 5.6% of our survey respondents. The least frequently experienced behaviours was someone suggesting or implying that one was not capable of performing their role, and being criticised for not behaving in stereotypically gender conforming ways. Despite the reporting of high levels of sexism and sexual harassment during remote working, one interesting finding that came out of the survey was that for almost all behaviours, survey participants reported a perception that these were occurring less frequently while working remotely compared to in the office. And if you have a look at the graph on the right, you can see quite a significant decrease for making comments or jokes or put downs in a work meeting based on sex. The only behaviour that marginally increased was assuming, commenting or indicating that someone is not committed to their job. And interesting, this was driven by the male respondents to our survey. So as a finding, we think that the perceived reduction in sexism and sexual harassment during remote working that we see is a hopeful sign and indicates like some of the likely benefits of remote working for all workers, particularly as we think of this sort of playing an increasing role in the new normal and the working lives of many Victorians in 2021 and beyond. However, we just really wanted to stress that more work needs to be done to understand the specific reasons for this reduction. The shift to remote work from physical workplaces is complex, and it's not clear from our survey results which changes are the ones responsible for the perceived decrease in these inappropriate behaviours. It could be things that like perhaps communication channels used in remote working provide less opportunity for the perpetration of sexism and sexual harassment. It's also possible that changes in a working environment and this sort of shift could allow for the development of new norms in the workplace in a kind of post-Me Too era where workplaces are increasingly acknowledging the seriousness of sexism and sexual harassment at work. And it's also possible that some of the behaviours in remote working, just due to the kind of reduced physical proximity of colleagues, are less visible, and we want to acknowledge that. However, in the survey, we did make sure that when we were talking about witnessing, we were asking people both about what they saw, but also we included what people heard about, and that was to account for the perhaps limited ability of people or reduced ability of people to kind of see these behaviours. And so we thought it was important to acknowledge that conversations between colleagues may still be happening, and we wanted to capture that important perspective as well. But I think it's an interesting finding, but one that needs to sort of be drilled into further and further explored as Victorian workplaces kind of look to implementation of the Gender Equality Act. And look, nonetheless, despite this perceived reduction, and as foreshadowed by the Minister, it's just really critical to remember that these behaviours are still very prevalent and that there are some groups within a workplace who experience these behaviours more than others. So you can see in the graph on the left that 20% of women indicated that they'd personally experienced sexism and sexual harassment during remote working, compared to 16% of men. And interestingly, we see fairly similar rates of kind of taking action in response to these behaviours. In the graph on the right, you can see that 1 in 4 younger workers experience sexism and sexual harassment while working remotely, and half of younger workers witness sexism and sexual harassment while working remotely. And not on the slide, but also very interestingly, we looked at the experience of entry-level workers, and we found that 24% of entry-level workers reported experiencing sexism and sexual harassment while working remotely, which is also above the average rate of 18% across all Victorians. And interestingly, in contrast, 16% of what we classified as professional staff and 17% of senior management reported experience sexism and sexual harassment, so below the average for those two groups. Another kind of key area that we asked people about, as I flagged earlier, was the action people take in response to experiencing sexism and sexual harassment in the workplace. And we believe that our findings on taking action constitute some of the sort of earliest available evidence of whether and how people take action against these inappropriate behaviours in remote working settings. So encouragingly, we see, if you have a look at the graph on the left, that despite the novelty of this new context and the sort of constraints on interpersonal communication that colleagues and employees may face working remotely, there is really strong support for taking action and bystander action in response to sexism and sexual harassment. So you'll see there that 91% of all survey participants thought that some form of action needed to be taken in response to these behaviours. In the middle, you'll see that of all the people that we surveyed, half of those, or most, who experienced or witnessed sexism and sexual harassment took some action in response. So that's obviously less than the kind of indication of people who believe some form of action should be taken. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I'll touch on later. But I just wanted to note that this figure, the sort of 49.2%, indicates that there is obviously more work to be done to support and encourage people to take action, particularly bystander action. But I just wanted to also note that this is a sort of relatively high rate of taking action compared to other pieces of work that we have done and seen in the past. So while there is more work to be done, this is another encouraging finding. I believe the Australian Human Rights Commission report that I referred to earlier found that I think 30% of people took bystander action in response to witnessing sexism and sexual harassment at work. And we found a similar figure when we were doing a behavioural intervention to encourage bystander action on a university campus in Victoria. So obviously here we're talking about different timeframes and different contexts, and we also asked about slightly different behaviours in all these pieces of work. But I just thought it was important to note that this kind of potential increase in people taking action in response is really encouraging and something that policymakers and workplaces should be looking to moving forward. And from our results, it's very difficult to know exactly why this might be. But again, speculating, it may be that the kind of reduction in physical proximity means that the perception of repercussions or immediate repercussions from taking action in response is lessened. Another thing that's possible is that if these behaviours are being perpetrated in online environments, there may be sort of a virtual record of a comment made, and that could make it easier to sort of take and support action moving forward. However, unfortunately, the survey really did find that there are still real barriers to people taking action, and I just wanted to quickly highlight some of what we found today. Interestingly, confidence to take action wasn't something that came out as a key barrier, which is encouraging, but perhaps not what we would have expected to see. So in our sample, 70% of people said that they felt that they actually did have the knowledge and confidence to intervene. But the barriers that we saw were very much around a perception of repercussions in the workplace. So jobs, promotions, perceptions of being a troublemaker, and this was particularly felt by entry-level workers. And we also heard about a lack of kind of organisational support or culture that supports kind of the taking of action, which is obviously something that needs to be addressed as well. And interestingly, 40% of our sample said that they thought that their workplace proactively prevented sexism and sexual harassment. So there's obviously room for improvement there. So coming out of the survey, one thing that we just wanted to recommend, and I stress that this is part of sort of a suite of recommendations in our full report, but I just wanted to highlight a recommendation that workplaces continue to offer remote working options in 2021 and beyond. We think the perceived reduction in sexism and sexual harassment that we see in our survey results is encouraging, and also we note that kind of the offering of flexible and remote working is sort of beneficial in terms of gender equality more broadly, and allowing people to kind of fit their work in with sort of other commitments that may have. In terms of how to go about doing this, we suggest that workplaces conduct a quick survey to find out what aspects of remote working employees found the most beneficial and incorporate these into their policies, and then use some behavioural tools to encourage uptake of flexible and remote working through sort of modelling by senior leaders and other things that are detailed in the report. But I just wanted to stress, and you'll see in the box on the right, that the intent of this recommendation is absolutely not to remove people who experience sexism and sexual harassment from the workplace as a way to prevent these behaviours. What we're really trying to do is encourage workplaces to give employees and workers sort of choice and autonomy around how they engage with their colleagues. And absolutely, we acknowledge that this is not a silver bullet and must be implemented with other interventions to prevent sexism and sexual harassment, as this sort of in and of itself doesn't get to the underlying causes of some of those behaviours. And lastly, obviously, for some people, remote working placed extra pressure on them. And so we would really stress the importance of allowing employees to choose what works for them in a given situation. And just before I wrap up, there's been a sort of emphasis in the introductions on sort of practical tools for workplaces and policymakers to sort of take forward in 2021 and beyond. And so I just wanted to put a few up on the screen here, noting that we've really stressed it's important that workplaces continue to do work to better understand the drivers of what we've seen as a perceived reduction in these behaviours, but also just think about learning more about how these behaviours manifest in remote working environments, so we continue to learn and adapt and develop effective strategies to respond and prevent them. I mentioned pulse surveys quickly on the slide before, but they can be a really great way to just kind of check in with a sort of workforce regularly around sort of what's happening and what their experiences and any challenges they're facing. Vic Health will also be releasing, following this kind of piece of work, a workplace survey tool for any workplaces that want to do their own kind of research into what is happening in their specific context in remote working environments. And in a previous piece of work, Vic Health and BIT put together a Take Action Guide, which is a guide to help workplaces encourage bystander action in response to sexism and sexual harassment. So another fantastic resource there, which is also up on the Vic Health website. But I just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody for having me today. And I'm really looking forward to sort of hearing from you in the Q&A session and answering any questions. And please don't hesitate to reach out after today. This is an area that we're very interested in, and BIT would love to kind of talk through any questions that you might have. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. Such interesting and important research. As you said, some sobering findings, but also some encouraging results there as well. Well, we might get straight on to the next resource, and I'm going to invite Mark to talk to us about the Framing Gender Equality Message Guide. So Mark Chenery is the co-founder and director of Common Cause Australia, and he is a communications expert and trainer who works with progressive organisations and political parties to incorporate a science-based approach to values in their work. His background includes working in advertising and journalism and heading up Action Aid Australia's community engagement program. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Emma. I'll launch straight into things, but first want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting from, which is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. Sorry, a few slides jumped ahead. So what I'm going to do is start by talking to you a little bit about our approach to communications before launching into some of the key recommendations that have actually emerged from the research that we've done together with Vic Health last year. So first, I want you to reflect on this question. What do you see here on this slide? And as you look at this slide, what most of you should be able to do is toggle between perceiving two very different things here from the exact same visual information. Some of you will see a duck or a rabbit, but you also see a duck or a bird, and you'll also see a rabbit here. And what's actually happening inside your brains is that you're very easily toggling between two very different ways of perceiving the exact same visual information. Now, this is something that we call in framing biconceptualism. So that's the ability of our brains to perceive the same thing from different perspectives. And it's a really important concept when it comes to communications, because you'll often hear communication experts tell you that you need to meet people where they're at. And while there's some truth to the fact that the better that we understand our audience, the better we are at relating to them, it's also misleading to think that there is any fixed place where most people are at. Most people are able to perceive the exact same issue from multiple different perspectives. So our job in communications is always not to meet people where they're at, but to understand where they're capable of going and to take them there or lead them there through the way in which we frame our issues. So when it comes to what implications for our messaging in practice, what that means is that we always think about, at Common Cause, about audiences in terms of 3 different attitudinal segments. On the one hand, we have supporters. These are people who, for analogy's sake, only see the rabbit. And it's very, very hard. They're quite fixed in their perspective. They only see the rabbit, and try as we might to get them to see the issue from a different perspective, they struggle. But it's good because they see the issue from our perspective. They understand the problem the way we do. They also understand the solutions the way we do. But then on the other hand, we've got our opposition. So these are people who do not agree with our analysis of the problem. Oftentimes they don't even think the problem exists. And it is very hard, if not impossible, to get them to see that problem or to agree with us that it needs to be dealt with. Sorry, my slides seem to be, I don't know, a bit of a techie glitch here. They seem to be flicking forward without me wanting them to. I don't know if you can help with that, Damien. But in the middle, we've got a lovely group of people who are the persuadables. So these are people who, by definition, in the way that we define them, are people who are not just weaker in their attitudes towards this issue. They might not have reflected on it as much as our supporters or the opposition, but they also quite easily toggle between seeing the issue from different perspectives. So they will see it both from our supporter perspective, but also from the opposition perspective. Now, in terms of the research and the methodology we used for this research, we did a few different things over the course of several months last year. The first that we started with was interviews. So we went about interviewing 15 advocates for gender equality. So these are people who feel very passionately about the importance of gender equality. And we interviewed them to understand how do they think about this issue at a subconscious level. Sorry, yes, the slides are still flicking through, sorry. How do they think about a subconscious level? What are the sort of metaphors and the values that they use to think about this issue? And from there, that gave us a good sense of what is the ideal perspective, what is the ideal frame of mind that we want people to be in order to accept our solutions. What we also did is then some discourse analysis. So we looked at publicly available sources of discourse on gender equality across a whole range of different settings, including workplaces. And what we did there is we looked at the way in which advocates talk about this issue in the public domain. So we know how they think about it personally through the interviews, but how do they talk about it publicly? What are the frames that they use in public? We also looked at the way in which the media talks about this issue. We also explored the way in which politicians talk about it, the way our opposition talks about the issue, but also the way that the public talks about it, looking at things like social media and comments on news articles and blogs about the topic. And from there, we had a pretty good sense of what are the dominant perspectives that Australians use to think and talk to each other about gender equality here in Australia. And based on that, we had an assumption about what were the effective ways of talking about it and which were the less effective ways. What were the perspectives we wanted to engage in people and what were perspectives that we really wanted to avoid engaging in people or we thought would harm our cause. And then we put those assumptions to the test using something called DAL testing. So DAL testing is an online survey of a nationally representative group of people, typically about 15 minutes long. In which we ask a whole bunch of different types of questions. We ask sort of typical agree, disagree questions. We do forced choice questions where people have to choose between one statement or another statement. And there we get to test in the real world context of a battle of ideas between our frame and the opposition's frame, which frame actually wins. And we also do split sample questions where we split the sample into two equal groups randomly, and then we frame the question slightly differently for one group and slightly differently to the other. And that way we get to see how different words or phrases or perhaps whole framings change the way people respond. And finally, the reason why we call it a dull test is because we include 5 audio recorded messages, about 30 seconds long, in which we invite people as they're listening to the message to dial up and down on their screen to indicate their level of agreement with what they're hearing in that moment. And the end result of that, and I'm going to show you a few of them in a moment, is very much like the political debate worm, except what we do across all of these responses across this survey is we break it down into our 3 attitudinal groups. So we explore the answers to all of these questions from the perspective of how do supporters respond, how do opposition respond, and how do persuadables respond. And the key thing that we're looking for are what are the ideas and messages that toggle that persuadable audience into a supporter mindset? When do they respond in a similar fashion to supporters? And what sort of messages and words and phrases and frames toggle that persuadable audience into an opposition mindset where they're answering more similar to the opposition? And that tells us what perspective we're activating by way of different messaging. Now I'm going to show you some examples of that in a moment. And finally, what we did is we took all the insights that we generated from that research and we ran workshops with people working on gender equality across a whole range of different settings. The end result of all of that then was the message guide that we're launching today. So let's talk about the results. So in the end, in our dial test, we surveyed over 1,800 Australians nationally representative geographically across the country. And what we found is that we've got about 15% of the Australian population who are our opposition. So they're quite a fixed opposition. It's very hard, if not practically impossible through a message alone or communications alone, to shift this group of people. Now, these people represent more men than women, and I'll get into that in a moment. But overall, it's 15% of the population. Now, on the other hand, the good news is that we have a quarter of the population who are firmly on our side when it comes to this issue. They agree with our analysis of the problem, and they consistently agree with the solutions that we want to implement, and they strongly agree with the principles at play here. But in the middle, what that means is we've got 60% of the Australian population who are persuadable. So these are people who both can see the issue from our opposition's perspective, but they can also see it from our perspective when we frame our message well. Now, just in terms of the sort of the gender binary split of our opposition, persuadable and supporter groups, women are clearly significantly more likely to be supporters than men. They're about twice as likely to be supporters, and men are about 3 times as likely to be opponents of gender equality than women are. But have a look at the figures there in the middle. So roughly about 60% or 2/3 of the Australian population, whether they are men or women, are persuadable, which means that whether you are talking to men or whether you are talking to women, it is important to be thinking about the way in which you're framing this issue to generate the highest level of support you can. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you 3 of the insights that are in the message guide. So you can have a look at the message guide and read through these in a little bit more detail at your own leisure. But I'm just going to take you through some of the logic behind why these recommendations are appearing in the guide. The first insight is around how we should justify why we should be doing gender equality initiatives, whether they're programs or they're policies or behaviour change, whatever it is. One thing that we noted in our public discourse analysis when we looked at the way in which advocates talk about gender equality is that they frequently frame the issue in terms of how gender equality will benefit everyone. So they'll talk about the fact that it will help boost the overall economy, or they'll talk about the fact that it will boost the performance of individual businesses. Or perhaps I'll just mention that it benefits everyone vaguely, which really is just suggesting that it will also benefit men. So we wanted to put this assumption to the test. Do people, in particular persuadable audiences, are they persuaded more by messaging when we talk about it in terms of benefiting everyone, or when we focus on it benefiting women and girls in particular? And what we found is the latter is true. When we talk about gender equality in terms of benefiting women and girls in particular, that generates a it generates a very high response rate, a strong agreement rate from persuadables, but it also generates more agreement from persuadables than does talking about gender equality benefiting everyone. I'm going to show you some of the research that backs that up. So these are just, what you're looking at here is a whole bunch of statements that we asked people to agree or disagree with, and they could very much agree or simply agree, and very much disagree or simply disagree, or they could neither agree nor disagree. And what you're looking at in the numbers, if you can read them, they're a little bit fuzzy on my screen. But those numbers in the middle represent how supporters in green, persuadables in yellow, and opposition in red responded. Now, that is net agreement score. So a net agreement score is the percentage of people who agreed minus the percentage of people who disagreed. Now, that means that a net agreement score of 1 means that you technically have more people actively agreeing than disagreeing with you. And typically in our message testing, anything above 30, 40, 50% net agreement is a strong message. So what you're seeing here is very strong agreement with all of these statements, which are framed very specifically around equality, either in terms of the importance of equality or the problems of inequality. So we know that persuadable people, not just supporters, respond very well to when we frame this issue in terms of equality. But we also did a split test in which we, half the group A, received the message that government should do more to address gender inequality because it will benefit everyone. And the other half of respondents received the message that government should do more to address gender inequality because women and girls deserve to be treated as equal. So one refers to it in terms of benefiting everyone, and another makes it very specifically about benefits to women and girls. And this is what we found. Doesn't make a huge difference to supporters because they don't have much to move, 98 and 99% net agreement, which is universal agreement pretty much. Whereas persuadables actually respond better by 8 percentage points to the message that specifically refers to government doing something because women and girls specifically will benefit. Now, interestingly, when we looked at this in the context of men who were responding to the survey, what we found is that the second message, the message that framed gender equality in terms of specifically benefits to women and girls and excluding men, who would be part of the benefits all group, men responded better. In other words, even men respond better to government doing something about gender equality when we frame the issue in terms of benefits to women and girls specifically. Now, the second key insight is around the importance of talking about the causes of inequality, not simply the outcomes of inequality, how it manifests. Now, this is really important because when we looked at the public discourse, again, from advocates, one thing that we noted is that advocates spend a lot of their time when talking about the problem simply regurgitating facts about unequal outcomes between men and women. Now, the problem is that if we don't point out that what caused those outcomes, unfortunately, persuadable people also believe this, that it's natural for men and women to want different things out of life. So there's a 75% net agreement from persuadables to this statement. And since women and men naturally want different things out of life, surely we can expect them to also have different outcomes as a result. So when we talk about the wage gap, or we talk about women being underrepresented in leadership or in politics, there's a danger that what persuadable people hear is, yes, men and women are different, hence the different outcomes between men and women. There's nothing to see here, there's no problem. However, and when we tested this in a forced choice scenario, so we tested men enjoy more opportunities, power and resources in life than women, versus women have the same opportunities as men, they just choose different paths, and we forced people to choose which of these statements sounded most right to them. This is what happened with persuadables. They were split down the middle. This was not a frame that we won when we framed our issue in terms of outcomes alone. Now, the good news is, while persuadable people can be very much persuaded by the idea that men and women are just naturally different, they also respond really strongly to the idea that discrimination is wrong. So when we frame the problem, not just in terms of outcomes, but also in terms of unequal expectations, and treatment and pressures on men and women, that's when we really win. So, for example, we shouldn't make assumptions about people based on their gender. We've got 84% net agreement from Persuadables there, so an even higher level of agreement. This is true across a whole range of different statements. So treating women and girls differently because of their gender is wrong. It is wrong for businesses to pay women less than men for doing the same work. It's wrong for women to be overlooked for promotions and pay rises they deserve. And a person's gender should not get in the way of them leading the life they choose. The idea that people are treated differently because of their gender really riles persuadable people up, not just our supporters. And when we did another forced choice question, this time framing our statement in terms of unequal treatment, we actually won. So when we asked people to choose whether a person's gender should not influence what we expect of them or how we treat them, versus it's natural to expect different things from men and women to treat them accordingly, that's when we won the majority of support from persuadable audiences. So when you're framing the problem, it's really important not just to focus on outcomes and assume that persuadable audience take the same meaning from that you do, but instead to also talk about the causes, the unequal treatment, expectations, and valuing of men and women and others, which leads to those unequal outcomes. Still talk about outcomes, but make sure you explain causation. So I'm just trying to flick forward, but it's not moving. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Finally, my third and final tip that I want to present to you this morning is around the importance of so yes, talk about the problem and frame it well, but when we're talking, we should be spending more of our time talking about solutions than on the problems. Okay, and this is because a general principle of communications is that persuadable people respond a lot better to solution-focused messages than problem-focused messages. This is something that we have found over and over again in every single message test we've ever conducted with Vic Health as well as others. And we absolutely found that to be the case when it comes to gender equality, whether you're talking to men or you're talking to women or you're talking to others. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is problem-focused messages. What you're seeing on the right is some examples of solution-focused messages. So for example, the top problem, these days women and girls are still discriminated against because of their gender, generates a 46% net agreement amongst persuadables. And again, 46% net agreement is nothing to scoff at. That's good. We're winning that argument. But when we say that government should do more to address gender inequality because women and girls deserve to be treated as equal, so we're talking about solutions and what should be done about the situation, that rises by over 20 percentage points. So, and this is what we saw across the 15-minute survey, typically a 20, 30 to 40% percentage point increase in support from persuadables when we talked about solutions. Now, this is not a logical thing going on in the minds of our persuadable audience. This is very much happening at a subconscious level. Just like Emma Hunt talked about earlier, people are not logical. They respond very much to subconscious cues and biases. And ironically, what's happening is that persuadable audiences are more likely to support our solutions than agree that there's a problem that needs to be actually addressed. Okay, so when you're talking about gender equality, you still need to talk about the problem, but overall you should be talking more about solutions than problems. And you'll see what this looks like in terms of some of the audio messages I'm going to show you right now. So we tested 5 different messages in this research, audio messages, 30-second messages. I'm going to show you 3 of them, 3 of the best performing advocate messages. We also tested an opposition message, but I'm going to spare you the pain of having to listen to that. I should say that our messages work better than the opposition, so we don't need to be too concerned there. What you're going to see as I play this message is 3 different lines, a green line for the supporters, an orange or yellow line for persuadables, and a red line for the opposition. Now, what we really want in a well-performing audio message is we want to see the green line rising really high, okay? Because these are our supporters and we want them to love the message. If they're not loving our message, we're clearly not tapping into their perspective. We're not reaffirming their worldview. Now, we want to see the opposition, and this might be a little bit counterintuitive to some. We actually want to see them alienated. We want to see them feeling uncomfortable about the message, because keep in mind, this is the 15% of the population who is strongly against everything that we stand for. If they like our message, we're clearly not being very clear about what we mean. And what we want to see then, and this is the most important line, is the persuadable line following the trend of the supporter line. If they are following supporters and the opposition is dialing down, that means we definitely have a message that is both toggling our perspective, but also taking persuadables along with us. So let's play that message now.
We all want to be respected as unique individuals with our own interests, skills and aspirations. But too many people find their opportunities in life are limited by gender stereotypes. In workplaces, for example, many employers overlook women for senior roles based on assumptions about women's leadership skills. Meanwhile, employers are less likely to grant flexible work hours to men wanting to take on more caring responsibilities at home. One way to overcome these stereotypes is by ensuring all large employers develop gender equality action plans to help them monitor and act on gender-based discrimination.
So a couple of things that you'll notice in that message. One is that we're following a particular formula here. We're following a vision, barrier, action formula and structure to the message, which we've included in the message guide for you to have a look at in a little bit more detail. But effectively, we're casting a vision in terms of clear values of either equality or self-direction. We're talking about the barrier in terms of unequal treatment expectations and valuing of men and women, which leads to unequal outcomes. And we're framing the solutions in terms of addressing those outdated gender stereotypes and norms and modelling more equal alternatives. And this is the same structure we've used through the next couple of messages. And the other thing I want to point out is look at the way that supporters and persuadables respond towards the last third of the message. That's when we're talking about solutions. You're going to see that throughout all of these messages. So this is another message. I'll just let you play that. Listen to that now.
We expect people to treat each other as equals, no matter their gender. But the reality is, too many of us expect different things from boys and girls, women and men, and we often treat them differently without realising it. These outdated ideas lead some men to think that they are not only entitled to dominate women, but that we expect it of them. And too many use violence to maintain that control. Raising our children as equals means freeing them from outdated stereotypes. Even the little things count, like letting all children play with both trucks and dolls.
All right, that's all I'll show for you today.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's always so interesting. I love hearing your presentations. I think I was one of the people interviewed, so it's really interesting to see how it all turned out. So now we have time to hear from the audience, and we'd love to hear from you all listening, and we can start the Q&A session. So have we got some questions from the audience? If not, I certainly have questions. While I'm waiting for some to come up, maybe I can ask a question, Mark, about you spoke about the idea of needing to focus more on treatment rather than outcomes, but then at the same time you said we need to focus on solutions rather than the problem. Can you explain a bit more how that isn't contradictory?
Yeah, sure, Emma. So, and it might sound a little bit like it. What we need to be doing is framing the problem well, but not dwelling on it. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when we should be talking about the unequal treatment and expectations and pressures on women versus men, but we shouldn't spend the vast bulk of our communications emphasising this. And I think one of the reasons why advocates often do this, and this is not unique to the gender equality space, people working across social and environmental issues tend to dwell on the problem. And one of the reasons they do that is because as advocates, we are supporters, and supporters respond really well to problem-focused messages because it angers them, because they already believe everything you're telling them. Whereas persuadable people, they've already got enough problems in their life. They don't want ours. They want to add another list of problems to their concerns. Whereas when we frame the issue in terms of solutions, it just enables them to listen. It enables them to potentially buy into the issue. So we still need to articulate the problem and make sure we do so in terms of unequal treatment expectations and pressures. But we can't dwell there. If we dwell there for too long, we'll lose those persuadables, or we won't maximise the engagement we could have had from those persuadable audiences.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. Emma, if I could ask you, there's a question from the audience about if there were any examples of diversity training that did work, and if you've got any links to research. I know you mentioned that, unfortunately, some of the programs that have been implemented haven't been showing any effect, but are there examples of ones that have been successful?
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma. That's a fantastic question. And I think, unfortunately, the answer is the evidence is still inconclusive, but there's definitely, I think, different ways that we can look at the issue of training and sort of apply the eye to different elements of that to try and increase its effectiveness and overcome some of those barriers that might kind of lead to people being resistant to attend or sort of not sort of taking on and following through with the content of those training sessions. So I think one thing, obviously, if training is mandatory, this wouldn't apply, but organisations can definitely look at how they frame messaging around inviting people to attend training and making sure that those include things like, organisational top-down support and buy-in, and also drawing on social norms can be a really powerful behavioural tool to sort of help kind of change culture and help people realise the importance of training and encourage them to attend, although I would caveat that by saying in order for a social norm to be effective, it does need to be a powerful norm. We don't want to fall into the trap of communicating a social norm that, say, sort of 56% of staff think that, training to learn more about diversity and inclusion is, an important step in changing workplace culture, because that's going to accidentally reinforce a negative norm, as it's quite a low number. So there's a little bit to be kind of thought through in terms of the nuances there, but there's definitely research in that space. I think there's also some thinking that can be done around encouraging workplaces to sort of encouraging workers to sort of take on some of the learnings from training. And from a behavioural perspective, we generally find that communicating things in behaviourally informed, very sort of simple and straightforward language that reduces ambiguity around kind of behaviours that are inappropriate and sort of responses that could be taken can be helpful in terms of sort of increasing uptake with training and sort of other policies and procedures in this area. And another sort of interesting thing from the BI space, again, indirectly relevant, but for training in general, if participants are encouraged to sort of set plans around what they will do kind of after training to implement what they learnt, and kind of very specific plans, sort of if I hear X or see that, then I will kind of take the following action. Those can be some other good tools. So it's a roundabout way of answering the question, saying there's lots of thinking being done in this space. I can absolutely look and see if I can share some resources, but there's different points, I guess, in a training kind of program where you can intervene to try and increase effectiveness of that.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, I think I hear what you're saying is that it has to go beyond just the training. And that there needs to be sort of, I guess, more holistic approaches that look at culture and policies and how people actually implement what they learn in trainings. Is there anything, perhaps Mark or Emma, you wanted to add around any other effective kind of strategies you've seen for building a culture of bystander action? Otherwise, I'll go on to the next one.
One thing I just very quickly speak to is I mentioned social norms earlier, and BIT has actually done some work that shows social norms messaging can be a really effective way of kind of in communicating cultural or organisational norms around the appropriateness of being a bystander and can be used to encourage bystander action. So that's referring to the trial that we did at the University of Melbourne. And as I said there, we sort of saw a really significant increase simply through communicating social norms to staff and students around X percentage of people feel that taking action is necessary, and also in response to specific behaviours. That was very effective. So social norms is a really good tool to use here when they're crafted correctly.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Mark, a question for you, wondering if a female voice would have elicited the same response, do you think?
Potentially, or maybe not. We didn't test it, so we don't know. But it certainly is one of the things that, looking in retrospect, I wish we had done. So only 1/3 of the sort of the 15-minute dial test was the audio messages. Everything else that we asked in advance of that didn't have a sort of a gendered voice, if you like. And what we found in the audio messages very much sort of backed up what we'd found in the previous questions and question formats we used. So I'm pretty sure that the recommendations and insights still apply. But what I wish we had done is used a female voice, because so many people who are advocates for gender equality are female. And it would have been nice to know and to have that validation that the response was good to a female voice as well. But yeah.
And while I've got you there, Mark, another question. Is there a difference between alienating the opposition in a political campaign versus a whole of population public health campaign? For example, is there a backlash risk?
Yeah, so we're not trying to alienate or annoy anyone. What we are doing through the research is assessing whether we have truly said something progressive and useful. That is why we look at the opposition and how they respond. Because we know that messages that aren't clear, we can fuddle our way and say something that pleases everyone. It just doesn't persuade anyone either. And so when we're looking at the opposition and how they respond, in an ideal scenario, we don't want to annoy anyone. We don't want to get them out of their trenches and fighting. That's not going to be useful to us. But at the same time, if we are saying things that they like, that is a very big red flag to me that we're clearly not articulating a progressive position in our message. So we're not trying to annoy anyone, but we're also acknowledging that there are some people who we cannot bring on board through a simple message. And that's an uncomfortable thing a lot of the time for people to recognise or think through. And it doesn't mean that you can't have deeper interventions with that 15% of the population and succeed. It is absolutely possible, but it's not going to be through simple messaging.
That's so interesting. I think that's a useful, really useful thing to remember. If you're trying to please everyone, you're not persuading people necessarily. And I think often we do try and do that, is have something that perhaps is relatively weak in the sense that it's sort of overly generalized because we're trying not to offend. But you say actually, in some sense, offending some people is more likely to persuade others. I'm going to ask, and people please do keep adding to the questions. I'll ask another one myself. Emma, you were talking about how that actually it did seem like that during COVID, people noted that there was a sort of harassment occurring less frequently, which is obviously, a positive and hopeful thing. But I guess my question was about, and I know you don't have all the answers, but just to reflect on, is that situational in the sense of opportunity, and how it's not necessarily addressing the root cause of the problem. And so how do you balance, like you said, the need for flexible work options, but encouraging organisations to really actually try and tackle the root cause of, which is perpetration, and what's driving that?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. That's obviously an extremely important point to highlight. And I think this is one finding that we've sort of spoken to about today and recommendation in the presentation, but it's one of sort of a series of recommendations that we make in our report. The others going more specifically to that issue of kind of what are the root causes of sexism and sexual harassment in remote working, and how can we address some of these? Because, I absolutely acknowledge that, while we think that continuing remote working options is sort of a positive thing. It's not addressing those root causes, and so it's absolutely not a silver bullet which should be implemented on its own. I think it's really important that it's kind of looked at holistically as part of a suite of things that workplaces are trying to do to really kind of tackle these behaviours and design prevention initiatives that really get at the cause of them as well.
Absolutely, thank you. Mark, there's a question here noting that the focus was very much on men and women, and did you look at how to include messaging that includes gender diverse people?
Yeah, so we did a few things that sort of isn't captured by the results that I showed you. One is we did actually ask sort of a non-binary question in terms of the demographics. We didn't get enough responses to form anything statistically significant, so we can't sort of microanalyze how gender diverse people might respond differently to messaging. But when it comes to the actual messages, we tested both. We absolutely very consciously tested messages that referenced men and women, the gender binaries. We also tested messages that was stripped of the gender binary. So we spoke about treating people the same regardless of gender, for example. And I'm fairly sure that at least two or three of the messages that we tested for advocates actually didn't reference men or women, but stayed away from that on purpose, just to see whether we were creating a clear understanding, even though we weren't using those gender binaries. And what I would say, both based on our results, in terms of comparing those two, as well as the results from a previous study we did on masculinity with big health, is that we should actually, and this is in the message guide, we should avoid the gender binaries when they're unnecessary. It actually doesn't help us. It is more likely to activate an opposition frame of mind when we remind people of those binaries. But it is still necessary sometimes to talk about the binaries, especially when we're talking about the problem, because it's very hard to talk about the problem without mentioning the binaries, which are part of that problem.
Very interesting. And I guess then this applies potentially to both areas of research about did the data look at other forms of inequality and how that intersects with gender? So is there anything we know more about, women of colour or women living with disability from that data?
Yeah, I might just jump in on this one really quickly and say in our survey we did ask questions and sort of attempt to gather data in relation to gender diverse workers, but the sample that we had in our survey responses was unfortunately too small for us to be able to kind of speak to those results. Similarly, thinking about workers from different kind of ethnicities and cultural backgrounds. We did ask her a number of questions around this, but again, we asked about a sort of quite a large range of kind of ethnicities, and what this meant was that we also had sort of sample size concerns here, and I guess reporting on that unfortunately runs the risk that the kind of results that we have aren't representative or accurate in terms of the sample. So I just wanted to note that, and it's absolutely something that would be really interesting to look into more in the future.
Thank you. Maybe some area of more targeted research in the future. So I'm getting close to time. Any final comments or thoughts you want to leave us with, Mark and Emma?
I think just a last kind of thanks from me. This has been a really fantastic and an interesting discussion, really great questions, and also really great to hear from you, Mark. And I think there is sort of more work to be done. Some of the findings we see in our research are kind of encouraging, but there's absolutely much more that we could do. So yeah, we're very sort of keen to stay engaged with the community in Victoria working on these issues. So thank you for the invite.
Thank you, Emma. Mark, any final takeaway messages?
Not really. All I'd say is that I'd encourage people to check out the guide, have a look at the other tips that we've included there. We have focused in the guide on providing tips that might confront or challenge the way we're currently communicating, because if we're not changing, then what was the point of the whole piece of work? There's a lot of things that we're doing right at the moment, but there's a lot of things that we're doing based on assumptions about what will motivate people. And often those assumptions are wrong. So it's really important. I'm really glad that both Vic Health and the Together for Equality and Respect partnership sort of funded this research so we could explore this in quite a bit of depth.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you. Really appreciate your presentations and that discussion. We're getting close to the end of our time. I mean, I wanted to, just acknowledge how important and significant both of those pieces of research are and how useful they're going to be, I think, for many of us who are working in this space. I think obviously the statistics and the data is sobering in many respects. But also, I think part of it tells quite a positive and hopeful story. I think it shows that Australians are receptive to these gender equality messages, and that we can actually perhaps be more progressive than we assumed. Perhaps we don't need to water down our messages as much as we thought, and we should be talking. It was interesting, I thought, Mark explicitly talking about the benefits for women and girls, as opposed to I personally often think we have to frame it in terms of it benefiting everyone. And it's interesting to see that actually we can be more explicit about that. So yeah, very useful pieces, and I hope everyone gets something meaningful out of that as well. So please do check out the Vic Health website for all the latest resources that have been launched today as well. I wanted to thank the partners, the guests, the speakers, and of course you, the audience, for participating. I also wanted to finally say an especially big thank you to Natalie Russell on behalf of Vic Health. So Natalie has been the driving force in ensuring this forum happened, and she's been dedicating and tirelessly the driver of much of this gender equality work at Vic Health for the past 6 years. Natalie has led the development of research and practice on gender equality in communities and workplaces, promoting bystander action and responding to backlash and resistance, along with her more recent work in engaging men and boys. It's actually her last week at Vic Health. And so we really wanted to just honour the legacy that she leaves behind, her boundless energy, skill and grace under pressure, and thank her for her incredible contributions that will continue to benefit many in the sector for many years to come. So a huge thank you to Natalie, and along with everyone else who's participated today. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion. Wishing you all a wonderful day. Thank you and stay safe.